to record well.
I got it. I had too many things open in my face. Anyway, welcome. It's really excited to be back for Social Sciences Week. This is obviously an event I really like putting together, not only just to hang out with my friends and present on what we've been doing, but hear what other people have been doing. And I wanted to really kick this week off with Nevin to talk about just some of the research work that we've been doing, and updates on kind of the what works in outdoor therapies. And in many ways, this is one way just to help us that we got a call from our publishers that we should start thinking about slowly how we're going to update the outdoor therapies book. So it's a good way to have a conversation about where we're going and what's next for our field. So really grateful you're all here. Feel free to use the chat box, ask any questions, and we will have a discussion at the end of this as well. So Nevin, over to you.
Okay. I just noticed, Will, that we didn't introduce ourselves. I'm sure folks
Oh,
know you, but maybe for those who don't, I'm Nevin. I'm a research professor at the University of Victoria in Canada. Uh, Outdoor therapies, adventure therapy, nature-based therapy, working with people outdoors, moving towards positive change developmentally, educationally, therapeutically. That's kind of my bag, my stick, my lane. Happy to be here. I think this is the third year for Social Sciences Week for me. I think there's been four or so, Will, you've been involved in. That's great. And Will and I have been looking at outcomes and its relationship to process. So outcomes research in our field has actually been quite good over the last couple of decades in terms of productivity. Not that there hasn't been methodological issues, but there has been outputs. People are saying this program works. We've used these measures. We've seen these outcomes. Yeah, that's good. And then when we start looking at methodological problems, we realize that we haven't spent a lot of time looking at process. How is it really working? All the way down to the theory of change. What therapeutic understanding can we say confidently, answering the question, why does this work? Because it's a common question. Why or how does this work, outdoor therapies? So today we're going to look a little bit at some of the background that helps us understand pathways, how change happens in outdoor therapies. We can talk a little bit about some of the studies that we're currently doing and what still needs to be done. And at the same time, weave a little bit of theoretical understanding throughout. Is that fair
yeah.
enough, Will? For
Yeah. For now, that's really good. One of the
okay.
things Nevin and I just recently worked on a paper about really looking at what are these outdoor therapies that we're talking about. And one tempting idea is to think about outdoor therapy as a specific model, as if outdoor therapy belongs alongside cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic, or solution focused therapy. But really, what we're thinking about are these commonalities. And this is something, and I'm presenting with Susan Milchek and John Healy, my PhD supervisors, on the Australian Wednesday evening about this topic. But John and I went back and we just started reading. We got really into the weeds about Jane Addams, who's considered just the mother of professional social work. And these pictures are Jane Addams' summer camp that she ran in, this is the 1920s-ish. And so for the outdoor ed aligned people here, Jane Addams and John Dewey being the guru of experiential learning from the early 1900s, they were called intellectual soulmates. They hung out together. John Dewey delivered um, philosophy lectures at Hull House, the settlement house that Jane Addams ran. Um, and there was this idea of the outdoors for the purpose of social work. That's my profession. Nevin comes from child and youth care and education. None of this is new. What's really amazing is how much it's become eclipsed by maybe the medical model, different ideas of how therapy works, the dominance of psychiatry as the dominant narrative of this work. And I look at these photos, and one of the major themes was to improve democracy, do things together. And so a big part of it was combating racism in with this camp, and getting different age groups to do things together, risk taking. So if you Google Jane Addams summer camp, I think it was called the Bowden Country Club, what you can find is it's like 1,000 photos in a historical document about all the different things that they were doing. Art classes outside, art as a way to understand your emotions. It was incredibly progressive at the time. And I think nowadays, sometimes we get stuck in this, what we're doing is new, but I think what we're doing was old and much more traditional to this work. So it's really amazing going back to this literature and going, actually, this has been done for centuries. And I mean, there was the tent therapy movement for people with tuberculosis even 40 years before that. So it's kind of an interesting narrative about that this was going on, understanding the outdoors for such a long time. And Nevin, I will go back to you with our fancy diagram.
Excellent. Yeah, do you want to put the bullet points up so I know what I'm supposed to talk about? Thanks, Phil.
Yes.
Now this is a visual of what Will and I have talked about a lot for the last number of years. It looks complex. It is not. And what we're going to talk about mostly is just the three outside ellipses, like those last quarter of the moons on the outside edges there. Central to the work, and we have to always be clear in this. Again, Will just said this is really old work. This is ancestral work or evolutionary work. When asked, I used to run wilderness expeditions, month-long wilderness expeditions within the correctional system in Canada. And whenever people said, how does it work? We would always say, well, you take a small group of interdependent people and you travel on the land where everybody has to be successful. So everybody has to contribute to the greater good. It's just the way it was. So everything that we've done in outdoor education, now in outdoor therapies, is in many ways simply recreating the way it was to be in a sustainable community living in nature. And we just replicate it in all sorts of ways, and people call it novel and new and innovative and everything else. But the central circle, the feature of this that is most common to people who do therapeutic practice is defined by the common factors. Whether you're trained in counseling like I am or in social work like Will is, you've probably come across this work. It stems from humanistic Rogerian thinking around relationship. There's a multitude of versions of it. If you go Googling common factors, you'll find different lists put together by either Bruce Wampold or someone else, and some have been critiqued. Essentially, we have to understand at the base level, there are things in our lives that will affect the outcomes of therapy. They're outside of our extra to the therapeutic process. And then there's things that happen within the therapeutic process that we have some level of control over or influence over. And those are the common factors of therapy. And it doesn't matter what type of therapy, whether you're trained as a social worker, you're a CBT technician, you're EMDR, it does not matter. Common to therapeutic change are things like the therapeutic alliance and the many ways we understand that in terms of the quality of relationship between the person seeking change and the change agent. The theory that you bring to your therapeutic practice, empathy, authenticity, motivation, being culturally appropriate, just creating a positive and helpful setting for someone to experience change in. That's the stuff that we have some control over in therapy. Extra to that or outside of that is what the client brings, their hopes, their aspirations, their belief that they can change, whether they have a self-efficacy around change. their strengths, their weaknesses. What do they have in their home community, in their environment? Is it supportive? Is it resourceful? Is it helpful? Or is it harmful? This is why we want to just make sure we're being really clear about the fact that even though we are outdoor therapies, we're still in the therapeutic world. Common factors still rule. And what we're bringing are what we're now calling the commonalities or the common factors across all outdoor therapies. And that's these three outside pieces. So top left, it's place-based. We make choices about where we go. We're ideally outdoors. It may be nearby nature and parks and local beaches and trails. It may be out on expeditions. It may be at camps like Jane Addams had at her country club. I didn't know it was referred to as a country club, Will. That's awesome. The top right corner, outdoor therapies all tend to have some type of bodily, felt, visceral engagement with the environment. So it's active or kinesthetic is used often. And then the third element at the bottom is that we're rekindling, restructuring, rebuilding the relationship that we have with nature. We do have a relationship with nature. Everybody does, of course, because we're simply a part of it. But to help with training and teaching and research purposes, we have to talk about it sometimes as if it's other than human. I mean, that's the Oxford definitionary of nature is other than human. So until we get our heads around that, that's still one of the elements. And so those are the three pieces that make outdoor therapies different in this model, in the way that we're articulating it. And maybe before I move on to the studies, Will, the last thing I'll say is part of doing this is just in a recent paper, Will said, part of our goal in doing this is to actually keep it really simple, like an Occam's razors approach. If there's the most simplistic way to be able to define or describe how something works is most likely the best way to describe it. And it's also most likely the correct one. We go outside, we choose places to meet with our clients, we engage in activities that are kinesthetic. Even if it's mindful and sedentary activity, we're still engaging with an environment. And we spend a lot of time doing the work to reconnect with nature and the natural environment that we spend time in. And then we have to make decisions about how do we go about as researchers to try to make sense of this and demonstrate what works, how it works, maybe what some of the actual processes are, the mechanisms, the pathways. Yeah, I'm going to stop there, Will.
Yeah, I think one thing, and why Nevin and I have been, I guess we have a really good, like a productive friendship in our work, is that it's never really about telling people what to do. So if you can have a model that says, sure, go rock climbing, go surfing, go sit next to a stream and do nothing, bring nature into your office, like where if we can capture what the real essence of all of this is, I think that ends up being a really good understanding. Where in the psychotherapies, what can happen is we become tribal and siloed, where we end up going, why don't the horticulture people go to adventure therapy conferences? Why is surf therapy on, for instance, in Australia, on the news every so often, yet we don't know these people's names? Why are we all not? So trying to build the biggest tent that we all can come in with a mutual and sort of collaborative understanding of what all of this is, while also being inclusive of the talking therapies, that none of this says don't talk or talk a certain way or be a certain theoretical understanding of how therapy works. What we're really trying to do is go, what is the big picture of all of this, and bringing that together, which I think can be really useful. I showed this slide last year, and I just wanted to recapture it before we get into some of the recent work we've done. I created this for my PhD thesis. I ended up not using it. I don't know why I didn't use it, because I really like it. But Bruce Wampold, who is an awesome psychotherapy stats researcher, he created this idea of pathways for change. We often think of mechanisms of change, as in Is psychotherapy even mechanical at all? I would say no, but it's the common language that we use. So I just want to use this as another kind of framework for what we're doing here, which is practitioner, participant. Sometimes you're in a group, but that's a responsive relationship. You're working together. We're tailoring the work to each other. And remember, Nevin just said that our work is place-based. That's the intentional setting where we're meeting. That can be a climbing gym or the cliff or the river or the garden or the park, anywhere. And then we're engaged in a therapeutic alliance. And I think the therapeutic alliance is something that it sometimes just means have a good relationship with your clients. And I'm obviously down with that, but it also means having consensus about why you're in a relationship together. What's the purpose of our work together? And the example I always use is you could have a client that really likes you, who really wants to work on their depression, and then hates doing art therapy with you. So also having agreement about the means and methods, what you're going to do together is important. So in many ways, even though Nevin and I, for much of our careers, have worked with what we'd call involuntary clients, the only involuntary part is probably them walking through the door. You don't have a good alliance with someone who involuntarily doesn't want to work on the things that you want. So your client is always an active participant in that therapy. So that's really important to a good alliance, that we know that relational bond, the purpose of our work, and are we liking what we're doing? Is what we're doing aligned with the purpose? And then we have these pathways for change. And so for some, it's just experiencing a real relationship. For others, it's success and mastery. And success and mastery doesn't mean successfully climbing a mountain. It could be successfully saying no and making meaning from that experience. It could also be the mastery is usually always has to be in relation to the client's problem. So for instance, if you have a young person who's highly distractible in the classroom and they sit outside with you and spark a fire in the rain, you then get to do the work of talking with them about how are you able to do that? Was that different than life at home or life in the classroom? So you're creating mastery through the active experience. And then hope and expectancy. This gets into kind of placebo. Also, I've been talking with my friend Max in Spain quite regularly about this idea of a pilgrimage, right? Like there's trails in Spain that people go on to do a pilgrimage, to go do something that kind of has no therapeutic value more than what the person makes meaning from doing the hike, right? And all of that is linked with improved quality of life. This is just that last little box there is really just all the kind of outcomes that we see in the research. And then because we're experiential people, we also think about everything in a circle, that then you have to reflect on it over and over again. It's what we do. We just talk in circles. So what I like is, can the practitioner take the client's experience and reflect on it, reflect on the client's experience of the therapeutic alliance, and bring that back to the next adventure that they go on. And we also want to know how the client is making meaning from that outdoor experience. Many of us who are really passionate about the outdoor therapies have read time and time again that it's nature that passively heals you. And nature also passively gives you a sunburn or you get bit by a snake. So nature is kind of agnostic to your healing. Well, I guess not kind of, it's totally agnostic to your healing. So we want to make sure that we're understanding how the client is making meaning and transferring that to life outside of the therapy environment. And that kind of brings us to what I think is, this is the next study, Nevin, this is the only time I've ever said Nevin, I think I have to be first author on this. This is my pride and joy. And we've never fought about author order before in our lives, and we didn't really fight anyway. So, but this study I think is so cool, and it shows that no one gets into this work to count numbers. I get that when we talk about outcome data, we all just want to be there and be useful for other people and helpful. And this study, I think, really shows just a really foundational baseline to understanding how it can really make the outdoors count for other people. So I'll pull up your bullet points, Nevin.
Thanks, Will. This particular study that Will's talking about, we can throw it in the chat box if people want to have a look at it, but it was published in the journal Youth. Is based on a large sample of wilderness therapy participants in outdoor behavioral health care in the United States. It's a data set we got access to a few years ago, and it took us a few years to get the studies published. Whole story behind that, we'll leave that for now. Good measures were used. So we've got 20 plus years of wilderness therapy research out of the United States showing overwhelmingly positive outcomes. Again, as I said at the beginning, we have lots of outcome data. Lots of outcome data suggests, especially when it's positive, that something good is going on. There's positive results. So there's been additional investment in that body of literature that has led to things like significant claims of effectiveness over other forms of treatment or treatment as usual. There's been cost benefit analyses done, which is saying it's, it's more effective financially and it's more effective than other forms of treatment. Well, some of those claims we struggled with because we know that because of the common factors that no one treatment is actually realistically any better than any other treatment. And so when claims of 424% effectiveness come up, we kind of question that and say, yeah, no. So we get a large sample of data across 16, different programs. We have over 6,000 youth, almost 6,500 youth in this large sample. We know 50% on average, depending on how you look at the data, about 50% of them are there against their will, meaning that they were involuntarily transported. Transport's another area that was distracting us while we were trying to get to this study and publish this work a few years ago. And so when good measures are used, there's a large sample. It's really exciting as a researcher to go in and have a look. And our goal in doing this study was to shine a light beyond the outcomes and look a little bit farther into the corners through a clinical lens, through a clinical perspective, like what's really going on, what's happening, for who and why. And so, again, a good robust measure, a large sample, we look at it. One of the first things that shows up for us is that this clinical measure has a cutoff score. A cutoff score is used by the clinician to determine whether or not that youth would enter different types of treatment. If the youth is below the cutoff score, maybe there'd be a recommendation for some community-based interventions, maybe go see a counselor, whether it's in the community or at the school. 1/3 of the youth in this sample were below the clinical cutoff score. We'll talk about that more. Part of the problem being that the measure was taken after they were received and admitted into the program. So it's not actually a true pre-score of the condition that they're experiencing in their community. So of course that was a big red flag or yellow flag, at least in the air. And we looked at it more closely and started looking at the outcomes for those that were subclinical scores or in the clinical scores. We started looking at it by what diagnosis they were given, whether that was an official diagnosis or whether that was something mentioned by the parents is not super clear in the data, but we used the data that we had. And so it's a deep analysis. We think we wrote the paper in a really accessible way so that any clinician, anybody working with people could understand it. It's not overly technical in terms of the statistics that we used. And it's been very well received in terms of work that is looking at the exact same data set that we've been looking at for 20 years with these overwhelmingly positive outcomes. And by the way, at the start of the study, we recreated those overwhelmingly positive outcomes by simply doing a general pre-score, a general post-score, and looking at the difference. Wow, wilderness therapy works. It's effective. we recreated that first to show that we're using the same data, but then we dug in a little bit deeper, and that's where Will's going to go next.
Yeah, and I put an asterisk next to the involuntary in that first bullet point, just to say one of the problems was we really didn't trust this data. But what we found, which was so fascinating, is we could take intake scores, how a client presents at the start of this experience, which, like I said, we didn't trust the data collection at all, but we could still take it and predict the outcome, which was really fascinating. And also for us as common factors people, really encouraging that the numbers did not work differently to just the more conventional therapies. So we talked about those who come, and some people say cutoffs above or below, and some people say below or above. That's confusing. What we mean is clients that come presenting in a clinical range, meaning the way that they're subjectively reporting their own well-being is in a range that warrants pretty good therapy. It warrants good therapy, right? So for this first group, if you look, there were 1,900 that experienced reliable improvement if they reported at the start of their experience being in a clinical range. That's 80% basically. It's incredible. What that also means is 7% experienced a reliable worsening on this measure. So clinicians, we all need to know 10% roughly won't get better, will get worse in our care. 15% might experience no benefit. And then 80% can improve. That's remarkable, right? But here comes in the problem. When we take in clients that at the start, when they fill out an outcome measure, tell us they're not in a clinical range. Our life is fine. Now, caveat to this, these are youth and involuntary youth. And all of us know youth like to lie to clinicians, and they if you're involuntary, why would you tell the person that's holding you against your will that you have a problem? You wouldn't. So this doesn't mean they don't have an issue, but it means they're telling you at the start, I'm not, maybe I have some problems, but I'm not really, residential treatment is contraindicated. And look at how much worse the outcomes are in this case. Reliable improvement drops to 39%. No reliable change, 40%. Reliable worsening, 21%. So this had never been really published in our outcome literature, where to really look at if we're taking everybody into our programs, we do want to use their subjective meaning-making experience from the start as our predictor of if we're going to help, if that makes sense. So these are actually really, this is basically average psychotherapy data, which is, like I said, very encouraging. But a good example I like to use about this is I'm a very nervous flyer. And if I went to psychotherapy for that and I was given an outcome measure about how I'm going and I fill it out, the therapist would probably say, so you don't really have that many problems. And I go, no, I've got one very specific one. But then what therapists can do, and this is a trap, if I was in that non-clinical range, the trap is work not just sticking with that specific problem, going too global, spreading out, and then we're questioning our whole lived experience related to a very specific problem. And so you want to use the client's intake score as something that is really helpful in predicting your work together. So one of the reasons and obviously I'm a big outcomes nerd, but one of the things I really like about this is most outdoor people are really experiential thinkers. We're thinking about the client's experience. How is the client making meaning from the experience? And the numbers actually tend to back up that way of thinking, that how your client walks in the door, their motivation for walking in the door, why they're coming in, their view of their own issue, problem, anything. That's really what we have to work with, much more than how we set up the program and things like that. Um, so it was really amazing that that kind of much of the common factors literature was totally backed up by this large sample of 6,400 young people. And so I find this study really, really important for our field, that we really want to know who we're working with and who's coming through the door. Anything to add to that, Nevin?
Yeah, I think one thing that might depends if you're a table and stats nerd, you might be looking at the N, the sample size. And in this case, we had 2,400 approximately with those clinical scores and just under 1,000 with less than the clinical score, so a sub threshold. That's only 3,300 ish of that 6,400. For those who understand what we're talking about here, that means that there were thousands of youth that didn't have both a pre and a post score, which means in this case, these wilderness therapy programs are 80 to 90 days in length. That's a long, very intrusive intervention where they didn't have a pre and a post, which means what? You don't have any ability to measure change, which means it wasn't a clinically monitored intervention. And that is where we were openly critical about in the paper as well, because there's a question of ethics for the practitioners on that front. I think that's the only thing I would add, Will. And
Cool.
maybe knowing that they were there for 90 days, if you did have routine outcome monitoring, say, even on a weekly basis, you would find that that percentage that is deteriorating, you would have an ability as a clinician to say, this isn't working.
Mm.
Do we carry on? Do we try another week? Or do we move you on to a different intervention or return you to the community or your family? So again, when those practices haven't been articulated, when we can see it in the data, knowing that this is the same data that's been used for 20 years, it's quite well, it makes me sad, actually. It makes me sad to know that there's youth that probably would have done better being removed from those programs. I think, Will, you actually touched on a lot of this in the previous slide.
Mm.
But in terms of what do we do about this, or what are we recommending for practice? We need to understand fit. We need to understand what types of interventions will work for who, when, why, when the motivation's in the right place, whether it's an appropriate intervention for what the person is dealing with. I completed a Canadian wilderness therapy study a number of years ago with some graduate students, and I think we had about a third of the students saying, it was an 8-week intervention as well, but then it went into a residential treatment program in the same facility or the same organization. About a third of them kind of had a meh response, like an MEH response. Like I don't know if it was for me or not. At the end of their time in treatment, they had said, wow, that was a powerful experience. But at the time that they were in the woods, there was about a third saying, I don't know if this is really appropriate for me. It doesn't feel right. They may have been better going directly into a residential setting and doing the outdoor piece later. So fit is definitely important. We have to be talking to our clients. We have to be doing the pre-assessments while they're in their naturalistic setting, while they're in their communities and homes, not after they've been taken to a program. The dose effect for outdoor therapy service in relation to client outcome and levels of engagement, avoid homogenizing client experiences,
I
similar to
can
fit.
I can touch this really quick, Nevin. One of the things with when we talk about dose, and this is obviously a hyper medicalized term, one of the things we can think about when if we're monitoring outcome the way I think that we should, and I'm totally biased and rigid to this, but you when things get stuck, think about the who, what, where, when, and by when I mean how much. So quite often when things are going really well with our service, and all of this is in the ideal world, and we all have constraints by funding, our organizational constraints, things like that. Sometimes when things aren't going well, increase the number of sessions you do in a week, or decrease the number of sessions you do. Like, thinking about the things we can control as the worker, bring a different worker in, refer the person on. This we call bunting, like in baseball. Bunt that client to another worker faster than wasting their time just working with you. So a lot of times, even though all of us, I think so many therapeutic workers talk about tailoring and individualizing your service. When it comes to the outdoors, where we've scheduled, this is rock climbing day, this is hiking day, it's actually quite hard to tailor that experience to different individuals. So keep thinking about, maybe this person would benefit from just sitting with us and not doing anything, sitting outside. So that's what I mean by the dose effect. Sorry, Nevin.
No, that's good. Thank you, Will. The third and fourth bullet, I think, again, we've kind of touched on and talked about. What we were able to recreate in the data suggested that if a client was in a clinical range, what we saw in wilderness therapy is similar to that of many types of therapeutic intervention. There is going to be no change in some clients. There's going to be deterioration in other clients. It's just that we need to actually pay attention to the measures that we're using and the client feedback. I mean, we can hear, we can see, and sometimes, we just know that this is not the appropriate place for this individual to be. If it's not working, you have to make change. And I think that's, again, one of the most critical parts of seeing the data that we did. And that's part of the reason why we divided it by clinical and non-clinical. It seems shockingly obvious now that you would have at least 1,000 youth who didn't score in a clinical range, who were still sent to a 90-day intervention program, often not just out of home, but out of state, and at that, often removed by force, to see up to 40% no change and 20% deteriorate, and know that they still completed a 90-day intervention. It's like it's too obvious of an example. I mean, we could be looking at things that are a little less impactful, but that's just the areas that we work in, and the folks that we're doing research with.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing that I think we were really lucky for is to have such a big data set to analyze it this way, to show that there are really early on good predictors or trajectories of change. And that gets us to, this is much more happy and exciting. But for the past few years, Nevin, myself, Daniel Kavanaugh at Washington State University, and we were lucky enough to get a small grant to have Scott Miller from the International Center for Clinical Excellence to help us with this study. But we've been doing this outcome monitoring study using much more simple measures than the youth outcome questionnaire, which is 49 questions. It's too long to do that every session or every week with your clients. So we've been using the outcome rating scale. And so what we did was we invited anyone working in the outdoors or in some sort of adventure-based arena. One of the questions that we got at the time was, should you let people come into this study that maybe don't have a clinical degree? The youth workers, child and youth care workers, people without the psychology, social work, counseling. And if it was Will from 2010, before I came to Australia, I would have said, yeah, you're right. We need all the clinicians, the clinical workers. But after meeting people like Graham, Ruth is here as well, like meeting all these different people doing impactful work, I said, no, we should invite everyone and really see what's going on. So what we've employed these workers to do is simply use an outcome rating scale and a session rating scale. If they're working with individual sessions, every single session, if they're doing more long-term expedition-based work once or twice a week, There's a whole formula to that as well. And the kind of trick here is we started this presentation talking about common factors. And the kind of trick is that we don't really, we're not really interested in proving that outdoor therapy works. That data is pretty much there. Every study tends to show positive outcomes. That gets published anyway. But we wanted to start learning from the practitioners. Is there a difference in outcomes based on years of experience? Is there differences in outcomes based on your type of qualification? And so we've been doing this for, gosh, 2.5, pushing 3 years, I think. And it's been really interesting. Nevin, I'm going to be quiet because there's going to be an announcement, I think.
Morning, everyone.
And he thought it was a private room. It is a private room. It's just, it comes with announcements.
And thank you for your patience and
Almost
for
there.
your pleasant journey.
Okay. I made it this whole time without one of those, so that's pretty good. So one of the most amazing things, and this I did not anticipate, because with the grant, we had free training with Scott Miller, who came up with this, along with many others, came up with this framework. But in Australia, we had a group of people with no clinical degree. These are our friends Doug Mazinski, Mark Kartner, as many others. If you want to oust yourself as one of these people in this study, you're more than welcome to, but I've only gotten their permission to do it. And in the last 1.5 years, they collectively saw over 150 clients, and their outcomes in working in schools, working through Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme, their outcomes are on par with tightly controlled randomized clinical trials. It's unbelievable. It's just it's not unbelievable. It is awesome how important this work is. And you look at the average number of missed sessions. This is across the entire data set of clients. The average client these 4 people saw missed 0.28 of their sessions. What we have in the westernized mental health system is an engagement problem. We know that the most common number of sessions any human goes to in psychotherapy is 1. And these people, the people that worked with these superhero professional outdoor therapy workers, were far more engaged. And it's really amazing. And I don't want to say that that means outdoor therapy is so much better. I don't think that's the case, but I think this is evidence of really amazing outcome monitoring, of maintaining a really systematic way of ensuring your client's engagement and fixing that engagement when something goes wrong, right? Otherwise, the client comes to one session, hates it, and doesn't come back. These clients kept coming back. And I find and the last bullet point here, the some practitioners are better than the others. That's across the 4 people, but it's something that everyone knows, and we seldom talk about the differences of outcomes practitioner to practitioner. And so one of the real promises of what I think we could do as an outdoor therapy community, really leaning into this research, comes with this picture of Mark and I. Mark used his data, his outcome data, along with qualitative research from a researcher at University of Queensland. And Mark won the Silver Award from the Australian Institute of Criminology. Mark was the only non-multi-million-dollar funded program. Mark operated only off his salary as a school-based police officer. And I said in the previous slide that the outcomes were on par with clinical trials for all the practitioners in this study, but Mark's outcomes were like 2.5 standard deviations higher. He was that effective in this work. So I think in many ways, us embracing, if we do the work in being evidence builders, what we could really achieve in standing up against the cognitive behavioral tsunami, the mental health care system in the Western world is totally overburdened. Most people can't take new clients. I think we really have a possibility of making a huge effort in this by doing really good outcome work. And so I think the proof is in the pudding there. Nevin, anything you want to add to that?
No, actually, you covered the last three bullets fairly well in when you had the picture of you and Mark up. If you just want to put them up, we'll just visualize them. So we've mentioned this before. We're not looking at any one particular model of outdoor therapy. We're talking about a wide range. We have colleagues here doing indigenous land-based work. There's surf therapy going on. There's adventure therapy and horticultural and animal assisted and the forest therapy folks. I mean, it's what we're looking at is anything that falls into that original model that we're saying there's these three common pieces, right? We're place-based, active and engaged bodily, and connection with nature on top of the common factors and the standards of a regular therapeutic approach. But the idea that we're doing something that is accessible, it's potentially less stigma oriented, it is fun, potentially fun, right? We can actually enjoy ourselves out there. I know one of the things I get feedback in training therapists to work outdoors is sometimes it doesn't feel like I'm doing therapy, and they feel guilty about it because they're not doing exactly what they were trained to do. And most of that is because they themselves are actually having fun in the process as well, which increases the therapeutic alliance, which means your clients are then actually having more fun in the process as well and moving towards change. So I think, Will, you mentioned it as well, the access piece. We have issues. We have significant number of people that need our support. I think if we do build evidence in a way that we can understand some of the processes, show the outcomes, and at the same time make our practitioners better one by one, I think it's a multifaceted approach to strengthening our field and bringing some quality evidence to the table, but as well building the reputation both in nations and internationally. And that last bullet really is, it's been the bane of our existence for the last few years. Hopefully we're moving past it, but we're trying to create enough outcomes and process research and understanding of practice so that we can eclipse or move beyond some of the dominant narratives that are in our field, which is driven by wilderness therapy and the troubled teen industry in the United States. And so good on Will for starting the Atom Project while I was still mired in the data of outdoor behavioral healthcare. That was a very positive shift, and I appreciate his work on that front.
Yeah. Well, that's some of the stuff we wanted to cover. That one of the things is, while as I said at the start, while we're not convinced with that huge data set that we worked with, our much smaller data set with the outcome monitoring study, the numbers tend to work almost exactly the same. So it's a really great way to make sure, similar to your doctor usually is supposed to check your blood pressure every time you visit them, even if you're not there for a blood pressure issue. If you can figure out what the blood pressure cuff is for your outcomes and have something really easy to make sure you're on track, something's not totally off, it can really just help you to stay to really understand the client's experience of the experiential therapy. So I think that's really nice. And with that, I'll leave this up for a second. And I know that we do have about 10 more minutes left. I might just stop recording. And if people want to ask questions and chat with us for however long, that would be awesome. So let me hit stop here. But thank you all for attending as well.